At 31,000 feet, the impossible had already begun. The aircraft wasn't shaking from ordinary turbulence anymore. It was falling. A deafening metallic roar ripped through the cabin, followed by a violent lurch that slammed passengers against their seatbelts. Overhead, bins burst open. Bags crashed into the aisle. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly as terrified screams drowned out the engines. One mother clutched her little boy so tightly he could barely breathe. Across the aisle, an elderly man whispered a trembling prayer with tears streaming down his face. Several passengers frantically pulled out their phones, recording final video messages for the families they believed they would never see again. Then the captain's voice echoed through the speakers. It was calm, but only barely. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've suffered a catastrophic flight control failure. We're doing everything we can." The sentence ended abruptly. The aircraft suddenly pitched even steeper. Panic exploded. People cried. Some shouted at the flight attendants. Others simply closed their eyes, convinced these were the last moments of their lives. But while fear spread through nearly 200 passengers, one person wasn't looking at the people around him. 17-year-old Ethan Carter, sitting quietly near the back of the cabin, wasn't staring at the falling oxygen masks. He was listening, not with panic, with training. His eyes closed for only a second as he counted the rhythm of the engines, felt the vibration through the floor beneath his shoes, and noticed something almost nobody else could have recognized. The airplane wasn't simply falling. It was fighting itself. His heartbeat accelerated, but his face remained strangely calm. A memory echoed inside his mind, his late father's steady voice during countless dawn flights years earlier. A pilot doesn't wait for fear to disappear. He learns to think while everyone else is afraid. Ethan slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. The man beside him grabbed his sleeve. "Kid, sit down. Are you crazy?" Ethan gently pulled free. "No," he answered quietly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Ignoring the terrified stares surrounding him, he began walking toward the cockpit as the aircraft continued dropping through the clouds. Every step felt like it was carrying the weight of every life on board. When a frightened flight attendant rushed in front of him, Ethan met her eyes and spoke 5 calm words that stopped her cold. "I'm Falcon. I can land. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from." Just 20 minutes before chaos shattered the flight, Ethan Carter had looked like the least remarkable person on board. He sat quietly in seat 27A, a faded navy hoodie pulled over his head, worn-out sneakers resting beneath the seat ahead of him, and a backpack tucked tightly between his feet. A mystery novel lay open in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in nearly 10 minutes. Instead, he watched the endless sea of clouds outside his window, lost in thought. Around him, life inside the cabin felt wonderfully ordinary. A newly married couple across the aisle laughed as they planned their honeymoon. A college student struggled to finish an assignment before landing. 2 flight attendants pushed a snack cart down the aisle, smiling as they joked with passengers. A little girl several rows ahead proudly showed everyone her stuffed teddy bear, making strangers smile. It was just another peaceful afternoon flight from Salt Lake City to Seattle. To everyone else, Ethan was simply another quiet teenager heading home for winter vacation. No one imagined there was far more behind those calm blue eyes. The businessman seated beside him had barely acknowledged him since takeoff, assuming the silent teenager preferred his headphones to conversation. Across the aisle, an elderly woman smiled politely each time Ethan helped retrieve something she accidentally dropped, never realizing how observant he truly was. While most passengers admired the snowy mountain peaks far below, Ethan's attention drifted elsewhere. He noticed the subtle changes in engine vibration, the tiny adjustments in wing position, the almost invisible corrections made by the autopilot. Flying fascinated him, not because of speed or adventure, but because every movement told a story. His father used to say airplanes spoke a language few people ever learned to hear. Ethan had listened since he was 9 years old. Long before he could legally drive a car, he could identify aircraft by the sound of their engines alone. He could explain why a pilot changed altitude to avoid unstable air, or predict a turn several seconds before it happened simply by feeling the aircraft shift beneath him. Those skills weren't taught in school. They came from thousands of quiet hours beside one extraordinary man, Colonel Nathan Carter, a legendary fighter pilot, a devoted father, and the person Ethan missed every single day. As the aircraft cruised peacefully above the clouds, Ethan rested his forehead against the window and smiled faintly, unaware that within minutes, every lesson his father had ever taught him would become the difference between life and death. Years before anyone on Flight 728 realized they needed a hero, Ethan Carter was just a curious 9-year-old standing beside a small training aircraft at a quiet countryside airfield. The morning air smelled of fresh rain and aviation fuel. As the sun slowly climbed over the horizon, Colonel Nathan Carter crouched beside his son and rested a hand on his shoulder. "You don't earn the sky by being fearless," he said with a gentle smile. "You earn it by respecting it." Those words became the foundation of Ethan's life. Every Saturday before sunrise, while most children were still asleep, father and son drove to forgotten airstrips far from busy airports. Nathan never treated the lessons like a game. Every checklist had to be followed. Every switch had a purpose. Every mistake became a lesson rather than a reason to quit. Sometimes they spent hours without leaving the ground. Nathan would point toward the instrument panel and ask, "What is the airplane trying to tell you?" At first, Ethan guessed. Later, he understood. Eventually, he didn't need to think at all. His father wasn't teaching him to fly. He was teaching him to listen. As Ethan grew older, the lessons became more demanding. They spent countless evenings inside advanced flight simulators, practicing situations most pilots prayed they would never face: engine fires, electrical failures, hydraulic loss, bird strikes, severe icing, and complete communication blackouts. Whenever Ethan became frustrated after making a mistake, Nathan would quietly reset the simulator. Again. No lectures, no anger, just one word. Again. The repetition wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Nathan believed that confidence wasn't built during easy flights. It was built during impossible ones. Then, 14 months earlier, everything changed. During a routine military exercise over the Pacific, Nathan's fighter jet suffered a catastrophic systems failure. Despite guiding his damaged aircraft away from a nearby coastal town and saving hundreds of people below, he never had the chance to eject. The nation honored him as a hero. Ethan lost his father. After the funeral, the airfield felt painfully empty. The simulators were silent. The early morning drives stopped. But one thing never disappeared. Hidden inside Ethan's backpack was an old leather flight journal filled with his father's handwritten notes. Across nearly every page, one sentence appeared again and again. "When others panic, become the calm they need." As Flight 728 cruised peacefully through the winter sky, Ethan gently touched the worn notebook inside his backpack. He didn't know it yet, but in only a few minutes, those simple words would become the only thing standing between nearly 200 strangers and disaster. The first warning wasn't loud, it was wrong. Ethan felt it before anyone else noticed. A faint vibration pulsed through the cabin floor beneath his shoes, not the smooth rhythm of a healthy aircraft, but an uneven shudder that came and went like a heartbeat struggling to stay steady. He slowly looked up. Outside the window, nothing seemed unusual. The wing remained level, clouds drifted peacefully below, and passengers continued chatting, eating snacks and watching movies. Then it happened again, a deeper vibration, longer this time. Ethan quietly removed his headphones and closed his eyes. He listened. One engine sounded perfectly balanced, the other didn't. It wasn't failing yet, but it was fighting against something. His father's voice echoed inside his memory. Machines whisper before they scream. Good pilots hear the whisper. Before Ethan could think any further, a deafening metallic crack ripped through the aircraft. Krang! The entire cabin jolted violently. People screamed as drinks exploded from tray tables and luggage slammed against the overhead bins. The aircraft suddenly rolled to the left before correcting itself with a sharp, unnatural movement. A baby burst into tears. Someone shouted, "What was that?" The seatbelt sign flashed on. Almost immediately, the captain's normally confident voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered an unexpected mechanical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." His words sounded calm. His breathing did not. Ethan's stomach tightened. Professional pilots rarely admitted problems unless they had no choice. This wasn't routine turbulence. This was the beginning of something far worse. Another violent jolt shook the aircraft. This time the nose dipped noticeably. Passengers gasped as laptops slid onto the floor and loose belongings rolled toward the front of the cabin. Flight attendants abandoned the beverage carts and hurried through the aisle, locking equipment into place while trying to reassure frightened travelers. "It's okay. We're trained for this. Please stay seated." But even they struggled to hide the fear growing in their own eyes. Then every screen inside the cabin suddenly went black. A chilling silence followed. Seconds later, emergency lights flickered on, casting the cabin in a dim amber glow. The aircraft lurched downward again, harder than before. Several oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a loud snap. The businessman beside Ethan grabbed the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Oh God," he whispered. Ethan wasn't watching the passengers anymore. He was counting. The rhythm of the engines. The delay in control corrections. The increasing angle of descent. Each second confirmed the same terrifying conclusion. This wasn't one failure. It was becoming a chain reaction. He tightened the straps on his backpack, took one slow breath, and looked toward the cockpit door. If the pilots were facing the emergency he believed they were running out of time. The aircraft plunged again. This time the drop was so violent that terrified screams echoed through the cabin. Coffee cups flew through the air, laptops crashed into the aisle, and several passengers instinctively reached for the oxygen masks now swinging above their heads. The captain's voice returned, stripped of every trace of reassurance. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced multiple flight control failures. Brace for impact procedures may become necessary." Silence followed. Then absolute panic. A woman buried her face in her husband's shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. Two brothers across the aisle grabbed each other's hands without saying a word. Someone near the rear of the cabin began praying aloud, and within seconds, others joined in. Ethan stood. The businessman beside him seized his arm. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Sit down. You'll get yourself killed." Ethan looked directly into the man's frightened eyes. "If I stay here," he said calmly, "everyone might." Without waiting for another response, he stepped into the shaking aisle. Each step toward the cockpit became more difficult as the aircraft pitched unpredictably beneath him. Flight attendants struggled to keep their balance while helping frightened passengers remain seated. Just before he reached the forward galley, the senior flight attendant stepped in front of him, blocking the narrow aisle. "Sir, you have to go back to your seat, right now. My name is Ethan Carter." Her expression remained firm. "I'm sorry, but my father was Colonel Nathan Carter." She hesitated. "He spent 26 years flying advanced fighter aircraft. He trained me from childhood. I've spent thousands of hours studying emergency flight procedures." Another violent shudder interrupted him. The cockpit door rattled against its frame. Ethan lowered his voice. "I know this sounds impossible." He glanced toward the sealed cockpit. "But your pilots are running out of options." The flight attendant searched his face. There was no panic, no desperation, only complete certainty. She picked up the intercom phone with trembling fingers. Moments later, she listened silently before looking back at Ethan. "They'll give you 60 seconds." The reinforced cockpit door unlocked. The moment Ethan stepped inside, the situation became painfully clear. Warning alarms screamed from every corner of the flight deck. Red and amber lights flashed across nearly every display. The captain gripped the control column with both hands, muscles straining against controls that barely responded. The first officer worked desperately between the radios and overhead panels, sweat running down his forehead. Altitude was disappearing. Airspeed continued climbing. The aircraft refused to obey. The captain barely looked at Ethan. "You said you can help." She pointed toward the instrument panel. "Then tell us something." "Because we've already tried everything we know." Ethan took one slow breath. His eyes swept across the instruments. Within seconds, he spotted something neither pilot had considered. For a brief moment, the cockpit seemed frozen in time. Warning alarms shrieked without mercy. The control column trembled violently beneath the captain's grip, while the first officer fought to silence one caution message after another. Outside the windshield, thick gray clouds rushed upward as the aircraft continued its desperate descent. Ethan didn't panic. His eyes moved from one instrument to the next with quiet precision. Altitude, vertical speed, hydraulic pressure, Engine output, control surface indicators. Then he noticed it. The elevators weren't completely dead. They were responding, but only slightly. "Captain," Ethan said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "You're trying to overpower the aircraft." She glanced at him without taking her hands off the controls. "What are you seeing? The backup control system is still alive. Barely, but every large correction is canceling itself out." The first officer frowned. "So what do we do?" Ethan pointed toward the engine thrust displays. "Stop fighting the airplane." Both pilots looked at him. He continued. "Use the engines to help steer it." Neither pilot spoke. "My father taught me something during simulator failures," Ethan said. "When the control surfaces stop listening, the engines become your strongest voice." The captain hesitated. "That's not part of our emergency checklist." "No," Ethan answered, "because checklists cover what usually happens. This isn't usual." The aircraft suddenly dropped another several hundred feet. A warning horn blared through the cockpit. The ground proximity warning system announced, "Pull up, pull up." The captain closed her eyes for half a second. Conventional procedures had failed. Time had almost disappeared. She made her decision. "Talk me through it." Ethan immediately leaned closer to the center console. "Reduce power slightly on the left engine. Increase thrust on the right, very slowly. Don't force it." The first officer carefully adjusted the throttles. The aircraft shuddered. Everyone held their breath. Nothing happened. Then, the nose stopped dropping, only for a second, but it stopped. "It's responding," the first officer shouted. "Again," Ethan said. "Small corrections. Give the airplane time to answer." The captain carefully adjusted the manual trim. One click, pause, another click. The control column felt lighter. The descent rate began slowing. 3,500 feet per minute, 3,000, 2,400. The aircraft was still descending, but no longer racing toward disaster. For the first time since the emergency began, hope entered the cockpit. The captain immediately transmitted a mayday. "Mayday, mayday, Flight 728, severe flight control failure. Request immediate military assistance and priority landing." Static filled the radio. Then a calm military voice answered. "Flight 728, 2 interceptor aircraft are already airborne." Seconds later, another voice broke through the transmission. "Unknown advisor in your cockpit. Identify yourself." Ethan pressed the radio switch. "This is Ethan Carter." He paused, remembering the nickname only one man had ever used. "Call sign Falcon." There was complete silence. Then the military pilot replied with emotion impossible to hide. "Falcon, your father flew beside us. We're coming to bring you home." For the first time since leaving his seat, Ethan allowed himself a single deep breath. The battle to save the aircraft had just entered its next and most dangerous phase. The roar of 2 fighter jets pierced the clouds long before anyone inside Flight 728 could see them. A moment later, they appeared. One swept into position just off the left wing, the other matched speed on the right, their sleek silhouettes cutting through the gray sky like guardians answering a desperate call. Inside the cockpit, no one celebrated. The hardest part was still ahead. Captain Amelia Brooks kept her eyes fixed on the runway coordinates glowing on the navigation display. Her shoulders ached from wrestling the sluggish controls for nearly half an hour. "We're holding altitude," the first officer reported. "Barely." Ethan studied the instruments again. Hydraulic pressure had fallen even lower. "They're losing the backup system too," he said quietly. Captain Brooks looked at him. "How long?" He didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to guess. Finally he said, "Long enough to land, if nothing else fails." The radio crackled. "Flight 728, this is Guardian 1. Portland International has been completely cleared. Emergency vehicles are lining both sides of runway 34. Wind is steady. You have a straight-in approach." "Copy," Captain Brooks replied. Outside the cockpit windows, the lead fighter rocked its wings gently, a silent signal that they weren't alone anymore. Inside the cabin, however, fear continued to spread. Flight attendants moved through the aisles checking seatbelts, securing loose baggage, and helping passengers into brace positions. Some people cried quietly. Others simply stared out the windows, watching the fighter jets escort them through the clouds. A little boy pointed toward one of the jets and whispered to his mother, "Are they protecting us?" She forced a smile despite the tears in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart." They're bringing us home. Back in the cockpit, Ethan focused on the next challenge. The landing will be the real test, Captain Brooks nodded. We'll have limited control after touchdown. And almost no margin for mistakes, Ethan added. He pointed toward the flap indicator. Don't ask for full flaps. The hydraulic system won't survive it. What setting? 5 degrees. The first officer looked surprised. That'll make us fast. It has to. A hard landing is better than losing control. Another warning light illuminated. Landing gear, hydraulic pressure low. The cockpit fell silent. Captain Brooks whispered, "If the gear won't lock." Ethan finished the sentence. "We'll have one chance." He looked through the windshield. The runway lights had finally appeared in the distance, tiny white lines stretching across the darkening landscape, close enough to see, still far enough that everything could go wrong. The fighter pilot's voice broke the silence one last time. "Falcon, we're with you all the way." Ethan tightened his grip on the back of the captain's seat. The aircraft had survived the impossible in the sky. Now it had to survive the impossible on the ground. The runway lights stretched across the darkness like a narrow ribbon of hope. Every person in the cockpit stared through the windshield. This was it. There would be no second attempt, no go-around, no backup plan. Captain Amelia Brooks tightened her grip on the controls, feeling every tiny movement of the crippled aircraft. The control column felt heavy, almost lifeless, responding only after precious seconds. Beside her, First Officer Mason Reed read out the altitude in a voice that was calm on the surface but trembling underneath. 3,000 feet. Outside, the 2 fighter jets remained perfectly in formation, one on each side of the wounded airliner, refusing to leave until its wheels touched the ground. Guardian 1's steady voice came over the radio. "Flight 728, you're perfectly aligned. Wind remains stable. Keep coming. You've got this." Ethan took one last look at the instrument panel. "Landing gear," he said. Captain Brooks pressed the switch. For a long second, nothing happened. The silence inside the cockpit became unbearable. Then a deep mechanical rumble echoed beneath the cabin. One green light appeared, then another. Everyone waited. The aircraft continued descending. 800 feet, still no third light. The first officer whispered, "Come on." 700 feet. Suddenly, click. The final green light illuminated. 3 wheels, locked. A collective breath escaped everyone in the cockpit. "We're not done yet," Ethan reminded them. 5 degrees of flaps, no more. The captain nodded. The aircraft slowed just enough for the approach, but still carried far more speed than a normal landing. 500 feet. Rain began striking the windshield, reducing visibility even further. The runway lights blurred through the water. Captain Brooks never looked away. 300. The fighter jets peeled away simultaneously, climbing sharply into the clouds. From this point forward, the landing belonged solely to the crew. 200. Inside the cabin, every passenger had their head lowered in the brace position. Parents shielded their children. Hands squeezed hands. Prayers became whispers. 100. Ethan spoke softly. "Easy. Don't fight her." 50. The captain gently raised the nose. For a terrifying heartbeat, the aircraft seemed suspended between heaven and earth. Then, boom! The main landing gear slammed onto the runway with an earth-shaking impact. The entire aircraft bounced once. Passengers screamed. The nose tilted sideways. Warning alarms erupted. The damaged controls refused to cooperate. "We're drifting left!" Mason shouted. Captain Brooks fought the rudder, but the response came painfully slow. The aircraft thundered toward the edge of the runway. Ethan's pulse exploded. "Right engine idle, left engine reverse now." Without hesitation, both pilots reacted. The engines roared unevenly. The massive aircraft shuddered violently before beginning to straighten. Slowly, painfully. The nose returned toward the center line. Brakes screamed against the pavement. Smoke billowed behind the tires. The runway rushed beneath them as the airliner refused to stop. 2,000 feet remained. 1,000. 500. The cockpit fell silent. Then, with one final jolt, the aircraft rolled to a complete stop. No one moved. No one spoke. For 3 long seconds, the only sound was the rain tapping against the windshield. Then Captain Brooks lowered her trembling hands from the controls, turned toward Ethan with tears filling her eyes, and whispered, "We made it." At that exact moment, the cockpit door burst open, and from the cabin behind them came something far more powerful than screams. It was the sound of 189 people applauding because they were still alive. For several long seconds, no one inside Flight 728 moved. The engines had fallen silent. The warning alarms had stopped. The only sound left was the gentle tapping of rain against the cockpit windows. Captain Amelia Brooks stared at the runway ahead, her hands still resting on the controls she had refused to let go of until the aircraft had completely stopped. Beside her, First Officer Mason Reed let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It felt as though the entire cockpit had finally been allowed to breathe again. Then the emergency evacuation alarm sounded. The spell was broken. Outside, flashing red and blue lights raced toward the aircraft from every direction. Fire trucks, ambulances, airport rescue teams, and police vehicles surrounded the runway within moments. Foam trucks positioned themselves beside the wings, prepared for the worst, though everyone silently prayed they wouldn't be needed. Inside the cabin, flight attendants immediately sprang into action. "Leave everything behind. Move to the nearest exit. Stay calm." The emergency slides inflated with loud bursts of air as passengers began escaping onto the rain-soaked runway. Some stumbled, some cried, some dropped to their knees the moment they reached the ground, overwhelmed by the realization that they had survived. Ethan remained quietly inside the cockpit until every passenger had safely exited. Only then did he step outside. Cold rain greeted him. The flashing emergency lights painted the wet pavement in shades of red and blue as exhausted survivors gathered at a safe distance, wrapped in thermal blankets. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, people began walking toward him. The elderly woman who had smiled at him earlier hugged him tightly without saying a word. The businessman who had begged him to stay in his seat removed his glasses, wiping tears from his face. "I judged you the moment I saw you," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought you were just another kid." Ethan offered a small smile. "Most people did." The man shook his head. "Not anymore." Nearby, the young mother carrying her little boy approached slowly. The child looked up at Ethan with wide eyes. "Were you the one flying our airplane?" Ethan knelt so they were eye level. "No," he said gently. "Your captain flew it home. I just reminded everyone not to give up." The little boy smiled before wrapping his tiny arms around Ethan's neck. Captain Brooks watched the moment from several feet away. Unable to hold back her emotions any longer, she walked over and embraced Ethan tightly. "I've been flying for 23 years, she whispered. "I've trusted hundreds of co-pilots." She stepped back, looking directly into his eyes. "But today, the bravest person in my cockpit wasn't wearing a captain's uniform." As dawn approached, news helicopters circled above the airport. Reporters flooded the terminals. Across the country, television screens displayed one headline after another. "Teen helps save 189 lives after mid-air control failure." Within hours, the quiet teenager no one had noticed boarding the flight had become the name the entire nation was talking about. 3 days after Flight 728 safely touched down, the nation was still talking about the teenager who had walked toward danger while everyone else was trying to escape it. News stations replayed passenger videos around the clock. Social media was flooded with clips of the young man in the faded navy hoodie disappearing through the cockpit door while the aircraft was falling from the sky. Aviation experts debated every decision made during the emergency, while countless survivors shared the same message. "He gave us hope when we had none." Yet Ethan Carter wanted none of the attention. When he arrived at the airport conference hall for the official press briefing, he wore the same old hoodie that had belonged to his father. Cameras flashed the moment he entered, but he kept his eyes low, quietly taking his seat beside Captain Amelia Brooks, airport officials, and military representatives. The first question came almost immediately. "Ethan, people are calling you a hero. Do you agree?" He smiled faintly. "I don't." The room fell silent. "I saw 2 pilots who refused to quit. I saw flight attendants comforting frightened families while they believed they might never see their own again. I saw passengers helping complete strangers before thinking about themselves." He paused. "If you want to call someone a hero, start with them." Another reporter stood. "Then who taught you to stay so calm?" For the first time that morning, emotion appeared on Ethan's face. He reached into his backpack and carefully removed a worn leather notebook. Its edges were faded. Several pages were stained from years of use. "My father," he answered softly. He filled this notebook with lessons not just about flying, but about responsibility. He opened to one of the first pages. Written in careful handwriting were the words that had shaped his entire life. Skill earns confidence. Character earns trust. Never forget the difference. Ethan closed the notebook. The world knows my father as Colonel Nathan Carter. I knew him simply as Dad. He taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to help when fear tells everyone else to step back. Months passed. Ethan quietly returned to school, finished his studies, and eventually earned admission to one of the nation's most respected military aviation academies. This time, every flight hour was officially logged, every license properly earned, and every milestone celebrated, not because he needed recognition, but because he wanted to honor the man who had first shown him the sky. On graduation day, before reporting for fighter pilot training, Ethan made one final stop. He stood alone beside his father's memorial. The morning wind rustled the nearby flags as he gently placed the old flight journal against the polished stone. "I kept my promise," he whispered. For a moment, only silence answered him. Then a formation of fighter jets thundered overhead, climbing higher and higher until they disappeared into the brilliant blue sky. Ethan smiled. Some legacies are written in history books. Others live on every time someone chooses courage over fear, hope over despair, and action over hesitation. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that one ordinary person can still change the lives of many. Sometimes, the greatest heroes aren't the ones everyone notices first. They're the ones who quietly stand up when the world needs them most.